Hello, and welcome to Lay of the Land, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the latest thinking, new developments, and best practices in today's real estate industry. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out to suggest topics or guests, or with questions about real estate law.
Welcome to another episode of the K&L Gates Lay of the Land podcast. My name is David Rubenstein. I'm an attorney at the Real Estate Practice Group here in Seattle. My practice focuses on data centers, especially, also on condominium and general real estate development. I'm here with Paul Manzer from Navix. Paul, please introduce yourself.
Hey, good afternoon. Paul Manzer from Navix Engineering. And now recently we merged with Langen Engineering and Environmental Services. So highly focused in data centers and happy to be here.
Great. Paul, tell me a little bit about what Navix does generally and what it does specifically for the data center industry.
Yeah. Well, we are a site development, civil engineering, design consulting firm at our core. And now that we've joined Langen, right, we've got the environmental services and geotechnical services as well. So come ground and down, and not so much in the public municipality supporting space, but in private development. So we really like private development, the speed, how nimble you have to be, and in the data center space, that is really, really important. And that's what we found when we stumbled into it in 2006 and have been able to add some value there with our approach of kind of being the closest thing to, we understand development speak, but we're engineers at our core.
Great. And to share a little bit of what we do here at K&L Gates, we are a full service real estate practice. We do everything from, site selection, due diligence, purchase and sale, title, all the way through ground up development of all kinds of projects. But like I said, we are doing a lot of data center work these days, which has been very exciting. So to dive into data centers and what you do specifically, Navix is chiefly civil engineering. And Langen, I think, is broader than that. So tell me about the sort of unique challenges of doing civil engineering for a data center project. And I'm especially curious in how those challenges differ from other product types and other like major developments, such as an energy project. What's unique about data centers?
There's a few things. And in our experience, it's been one, data centers are highly focused on the technology and the actual facility itself, not necessarily the real estate end of it. And that's where we come into it, knowing that there's a long process before the actual building can compute and serve its function. The real estate activities need to be far upstream from that. And some of those issues that are kind of critical success factors to it are the fact that it is a 24/7 can never go down type of facility. And so that comes into your infrastructure. How reliable is it? How redundant is it? Both from power, what happens if that goes out? Yeah, there's backup generators, or maybe not. Maybe there's some behind the meter stuff. Water, what happens if a water main breaks? What's the supply source? What are the risks of this thing going down? And that really needs to be sought out very, very early, because that can define your kind of site selection criteria, or maybe your due diligence. The mitigation opportunities you have, they need to be built into the project's pro forma, or actually when you're building it, the little tweaks to open that up and make it a resilient facility.
I've been struck a lot in my work in how redundancy is so important. I'll build a site and there are 4 different fiber lines running off the site, whereas in most cases really only one is needed, but the risk of losing one of those lines is existential to the project. And the same could be said for power and water and just access, getting people onto the site. Sometimes sites are unbuildable because there's like a bridge. And if the bridge goes out, we can't get people on the site. It's really interesting to see all of the upstream considerations that go into site selection and then actual development of a project. And I imagine as a civil engineer, you get very, very into the details on that.
Yeah, it's what could possibly happen to make this thing have to shut down for a day.
Yeah.
And let's work to try to create solutions for that. Retail, you look at, do you have a hard corner? Do you have visibility?
Right.
This is not that. This is everything else that you don't see, to the point to where, from a security standpoint, could this possibly happen? Could the flight path happen? Everything.
Mm-hmm. it's funny because that's usually the job of the lawyer to think of the worst possible things that could happen and then work around them. But now, fortunately, we get to spread the love on worrying about this problem
Yeah, that's right.
with our engineering friends. So I think you mentioned site selection. Obviously, when you're selecting a site for data centers, you've got to think about power. Like that's the biggest thing that everybody's worried about. What kind of megawatts can we get on site and when and how reliable is it? But what are the other big site selection considerations for your clients in figuring out where to put their data centers?
Yeah, that's a big question, and one that I thought I had figured out about 10 years ago, and it keeps iterating. And the best way I can answer that is that there are different types of data centers. There's the AI, there's the traditional compute, there's edge, and there's and they all serve different purposes, right? And so there are some that where latency is important, so proximity to your urban areas is important. There are some where it's just bulk compute capacity, where you can go in a rural area. But it all comes back to power and fiber. They don't work without those.
Yeah.
There are solutions to solve for the other resources that it needs, it seems like, but if you don't have power, you can't compute anything.
In the sort of second and third tier site selection considerations of water availability, which is just important depending on the kind of site that you're building for cooling purposes, and then even just on like kind of the typical normal stuff that we deal with in development, like soil conditions. Are those kinds of things being examined before acquisition in your experience, or are they kind of post-acquisition considerations?
They're usually before, but I tend to split my thinking of site selection and due diligence. As in our world, we think of those as pre-acquisition functions and them being discretely different themselves, where site selection really is, you're trying to filter down to, of these several sites, which one should I go with, or what that fit the general criteria. And it's a lighter touch. It's just checking off, is there power? Is it an area that meets the risk profile from a natural disaster standpoint? Does it meet the failover kind of proximity from our other assets? Is it big enough? Those sorts of functions. And then once it's down, then the money gets spent to really kick the tires a little, so to speak, a little bit more thoroughly. And that's when you start looking at soil conditions or environmental risks associated with it. And because it appears as though it comes from, is it feasible to build or not, is kind of the site selection. And then the due diligence is really trying to understand of the risks that will be associated with any site. Is it a schedule risk? Is it a cost risk? Or is it a build out capacity risk?
Yeah, I think categorizing, triaging those kinds of risks is the sort of thing that other developers think about, but are just less important in those kinds of considerations, in those kinds of projects. But at data centers, when you tranche out those kinds of risk considerations, I think it can be very enlightening in the site selection process and then in the build out process as well. You mentioned edge data centers. This is a hot topic for certain kinds of data center users. Tell me more about what you mean by edge and who the users are and what's most important in building those sites.
Some of that is a little bit beyond what we do as the site civil consultants, but in our experience, the edge they're usually just a little bit smaller, and they're kind of on the edges of the major data center hubs.
And for the listeners, edge is a data center class, means, like Paul just said, right on the periphery of the hubs, and they are located nearest to the users as possible so that you can reduce latency. And those are the users of those edge systems are usually things like autonomous vehicles or high frequency trading. It just requires very, very low latency in the terms of milliseconds, right?
Yeah, the scale of those properties and of those projects are just a little bit smaller, to where you can kind of move through that process a little bit more easily. You've got hundreds of acres. We're talking about your campuses and mega data centers, that it seems nice because it's a big blank canvas, but it also has that many more constraints or challenges perhaps associated with it. So you could go through the same steps, but maybe you move through a pace that's a little quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. Edge is an interesting product class again because it's so inherently smaller and more urban, and in some ways more nimble because it's smaller, but in other ways more difficult because it's more urban.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You do have, your community considerations. And oftentimes when it's more urban, right, you've got the title issues and leases and things associated with the land because it's surrounded by other stuff.
So I'd like to kind of guide our conversation today in three phases: past, present, and future. Because the data center industry as a whole is really very young. Like, there have been data centers around since probably the late 90s in some form, but it didn't really become a mature asset class and a mature mode of thinking in terms of development until the last 10, 15 years. And just in those last 10, 15 years, we've seen some very large sea changes in how our clients, how the industry is thinking about building these things. And then, of course, things move so quickly that it's going to change again, probably tomorrow. And we are all going to have to adapt. So let's start with the past. You've been in the data center industry now for 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a very lengthy tenure in this industry. It is, like I said, not very old. What were the things that you were considering in civil engineering 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago? And how are those things changing now?
When I first started it, they were big concrete tilt-up boxes that were not very dense. Like, for the amount of square footage that you were popping on a piece of land, the number of megawatts that facility was serving it wasn't as big as you would expect in today's metrics. And I would say that back then the cooling technologies were such to where, they were still talking boilers and cooling towers, where water was a very, very important resource, and how they cooled and what happened to that water once they cooled, where do they send it? Especially when you're in a rural community and there's a treatment plant that's only, sized for 5,000 residential homes. And then you're sending twice as much as its community in just relatively clean water that doesn't have any biological, and it floods out the deal. So that was a big thing. If you're down, your municipal infrastructure was really important. That was very risky, to the point to where, seen projects where, to meet the schedule that they had to do, they were willing to take some pretty big risks in waiting for their state discharge permit and using Baker tanks to fill them up with the clean water until they had it.
Do they have to truck it off site and send it somewhere they can? And we're not talking about small amounts of water. Although the water is very clean, and although they can recycle it through the building a couple of times, it does have to go away at a certain point. And we're talking millions of gallons on a given site, and that's not easy to manage.
It was touched enough to where you can't let it go to the natural environment without an environmental approval that might take 6, 12, 18 months, which didn't work. So when the sanitary sewer system, it just might not have the treatment capacity to handle that. And then your other option is to treat it on site, which is a doable thing. It's expensive. And it requires a core competency in running and operating a treatment facility. And that's not the core business of what these facilities are.
And it's also not an especially deep bench. Like, if you want to hire those people, there's only so many of them, and you have to convince them to move to whatever area these data centers are operating in. And there's a lot of absorption in that field already. You say that early stage in the industry, but I'm still dealing with those water disposal concepts. And they're still working with local jurisdictions to build out the infrastructure needed to dispose of this water and treat it. And finally, I think we're starting to see utility service providers create special infrastructure to deal with this clean water, so that it isn't just mixing with sanitary sewage from the residents, because it is, like you said, clean, and it needs a limited amount of treatment before it can be released back into the environment or recycled into the system. But it's taken a while to catch up to that.
It has. Yeah. But luckily, I think it's getting there.
Yes. And also, I think since you've been around since the beginning, regulatory frameworks have changed slowly, but they have changed, especially as these data center projects tend to cluster in regions where there's a high availability of fiber or high availability of power. Those local jurisdictions, cities, counties, states, have learned to adapt to their new data center industry partners. Have you seen big changes in the regulatory environment in your locations?
I have, and I think it's driven more so in the communities where they have some experience and it's not the first time they're encountering it. There's enough press nowadays to where even those communities that maybe don't have as much experience, they're being exposed to the issues and they're looking at their municipal codes or their processes to try to facilitate and get ahead of that, which is good. But it starts even at like your municipal zoning code. Is it a permitted use?
Yes.
It's not listed anywhere.
Yes. So we got to go change the zoning code.
Is it that?
Yep.
Right. And how long does that take? And
Yep.
is it a public process? Is there community input and which is important, right? To get everyone on board. That might even help downstream, but it starts with even that. And then it rolls into your air quality permitting at your, state EPA authority, and the list goes on, right? But the more just awareness that all these officials have, it's talked about a lot. They talk amongst each others. It's really helped them understand what it is, because part of the issue before was that they didn't know what it was. And so there was a fear and they thought it was all bad, and they're learning, there's some things that we need to look out for, but the more comprehension that there is out there, the more they know how to just, mitigate against those impacts and adjust for it.
It's been interesting to watch from a comparative law standpoint, how different jurisdictions have adapted to it. Because, like I said, they tend to cluster in certain areas because of just the physical infrastructure that's available. And some jurisdictions have taken like a very pro data center approach. Some of them have been neutral. Some of them have started to react negatively. And depending on the tax structure, data center installation in a community can be very, very beneficial because, we're talking large amounts of sales and use taxes, and then the income provided by the jobs created by these data centers during the development phase can be enormous. I mean, we can talk about hundreds of people on site building the thing for a period of years. And then, on an ongoing basis, you have significant numbers of on-site staff. But then there are some, Texas, for example, has I think taken a pretty pro data center approach, and they've started to adapt the regulatory environment to make it simpler to build in the state. And then on the local level, we see various jurisdictions around the country adapting as well. And then in a place like Northern Virginia, like Loudoun County, where there are, I think, some 300 data center projects. And that's just the nature of the location of the fiber there. But I think they're getting kind of tired of it, right? And so the regulatory environment has started to react the other way. I guess it's not so much a question as an observation that it's been interesting to watch that swing up and down over the course of the last several years.
Yeah. And we don't get to interact deeply in minute aspects of those issues, but we are in proximity to those discussions just by the nature of supporting our clients or having a planning approval public meeting. And you can kind of sense that there's a sweet spot, right, where it's balanced, and then it goes past that, and like you said, it's kind of too much, or maybe it's affecting their utility provider, the power utility provider, and the people are starting to feel the rate increases, and that's when you start to get a little bit of pushback.
I'm interested in something you said about how the form factor of these buildings has changed. It was a tilt-up concrete box at first, and then we started to see different kinds of construction. And I'm interested in how the civil engineering picture has changed in the last 10 years as this has developed.
In the past, it was very much like the life cycle of this, that you were planning on this thing has to never break for 50 years, right? And it's going to always be this, which has changed. It's become a bit more of a modular build out type of mindset. And that goes into the infrastructure and all the stuff you see underground too. It's like, how do you plan for the potential and plan for the fact that the buildings will look different in 5 years for sure, maybe even 2 years. How do you anticipate that and plan for it, but perhaps not install everything and leave it to where whenever it's understood or known what the next form factor will be, that it will work within this framework. It's the buildings themselves seem to have gone from that very fortified fortress, concrete fortress that will never move, to something a little bit more scalable, a little bit more modular, that build out and adaptable. But yeah, when you've been in the industry for as long as I have, fortunately, like when you start to see some of your original projects being redeveloped, that's when you know, like,
this matters.
Yeah, it matters. And so it's really the infrastructure and its ability to process the function of the facility itself in a much more economical manner and efficient manner that doesn't take as many resources. You start to see the things above ground scaled down in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to the ghost of Christmas present here, which is, as we see technology change, what's most interesting to me about, it's one of many interesting things to me about this industry, is the nature of the chips that are being put into this building define in significant ways the shape of the building itself, the nature of how the building operates. And the chips are moving very, very fast in terms of their development. And so it's really hard to build a building based on current technology, but also make it adaptable and modular in a way that can adapt to a future form factor that we don't necessarily understand yet. What are the challenges? How are you approaching those questions now in terms of building modular, adaptable buildings that can keep up with the change?
Yeah. So the stuff underground that you'll see, they're likely a little bit bigger, or there's more of it than you might otherwise need to propose so that it can pivot as needed. It's interesting when you look at a site and you were doing a master plan, a concept before, and the blocks that you would put of what these buildings look like, and you try to project out what the capacity of this campus could look like, would yield some number of megawatts, knowing that that's not going to be what it ends up being. But you know that even if it got smaller, or if they changed the density of the building, of the data halls, driven by the chips and what they need, it might get smaller. So it might go up, or it might need to be spaced further apart because the equipment yards, more stuff's getting put outside. So your buildings are spaced out further, but the density is higher. So you're probably going to land somewhere close, even if the buildings change.
Yeah.
Like it is the proportionality of the building size to the actual compute power and the megawatt isn't necessarily proportionate forever.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, that although the nature of the compute and the amount of compute required to achieve a given result will change necessarily in the next year, you can build buildings that are capable of containing that compute and serving the power needed to drive it in an adaptable way if, certain parameters are met. And sort of on that topic, the elephant in the room for the last few months has been DeepSeek. And what if we are really living in a world where in the next couple of years, we really will only need 10% of the power that we thought we were going to need? When we build buildings with a 50 megawatt capacity, but we only ended up needing 5, does that change how the buildings work? Or does it just mean we have extra capacity to grow into?
I don't know that anyone knows.
No.
A bunch of people have a lot of great ideas. I'm excited by the prospect of what that does to make the effort it takes to support these facilities, if that becomes as efficient as it can be, and that competition helps to drive that efficiency. Sure, there might be a balance of space allowed, or the infrastructure needed to support something isn't what it once was. But does that open up the opportunity for those adjacent or those symbiotic uses, which we all kind of know, like these things reject heat. Like there's a lot of uses that need heat, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of, you can have a kind of a closed loop or a symbiotic relationship between two different types of use. And there's opportunity for that, I think, as we become more efficient in what we need to support just the core function.
It's funny you mentioned the concept of reusing rejected heat. In a completely non-data center related project one time, I did a very novel arrangement with the local sewer utility on capturing waste sewer heat and then using that to heat buildings, because it's just energy, right? And if we're talking about using waste energy, my God, data centers are it. And so if they're located in a place where that energy can be relatively efficiently captured and reused to heat homes or to heat office buildings, then it seems perfect for that kind of symbiotic relationship. I mean, that's very orthogonal from the deep sea conversation.
Yep.
But it's a cool concept.
It is a cool concept, and I'm kind of excited about where it goes. Whenever there's a disruption like that, humans seem to adapt to it and then leverage that to its potential again. So it's like a step function of, so it'll be something different. I don't know what that is.
I look forward to seeing it. And yes, I'm excited about the deep potential of human ingenuity in this field and in many others. Also in terms of, and this is maybe a little bit outside of your wheelhouse, but there are some big challenges industry-wide outside of data center, but in real estate generally, that we're facing in terms of like supply chain disruptions, cost of construction, labor shortages. We could be just right now, it's very difficult to just get the bodies for electricians on site. And as the immigration picture changes, it's going to be maybe harder to just get framers and concrete guys on site.
Yep.
What are you seeing? What are the conversations you're having with your clients about how to adapt to those kinds of construction changes?
Well, the conversations they're quite interesting, where they may have the financing or there's the backing to build these things, and there's a demand from a society seemingly to build these, and the pace of construction is hard to keep up with the demand. So then you throttle that. They've got the funding and they want to do the projects. You can't physically build it, even if you had the workers. And if you didn't have the workers, well, then it becomes even harder. But just knowing that at a peak time on site of one of the large campuses, right, there'll be 500 workers all interacting and moving, and not bumping into each other. It's an amazing thing. And the equipment, you produce enough equipment, and the technologies are changing, and maybe that equipment, like having to put a reserve and put your order in and have to pay for it 18 months before it actually shows up, is going to precede some of your traditional real estate decisions that you need to make.
Right.
Which is kind of part of the game, but you have people that are knowledgeable on it. You can manage that risk to the best of the ability. It's kind of part of the game.
Yeah. I mean, when you know that you're probably going to need like a couple 100 miles of copper wire 18 months from now, and it's just going to take that long to get it, but you don't know yet where that wire is going to go. You just have to order it and hope for the best.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge. Just the physical constraints, the regulatory constraints, not tiny either, but the physical constraints of building are really challenging to work within when you have such a rapid paced industry as we have.
Yeah, the constraints on labor and equipment and things like that, those are going to start to precede where they would otherwise land in other industries.
Yeah.
Right? You have to make those decisions and those financial commitments before you normally would. And
before you acquire the site.
Yeah.
It's a big consideration. And to get back to the regulatory idea, like I said, the regulatory environment has been changing, especially in certain jurisdictions. And on the federal level, we don't yet know what the new regulatory environment is going to look like. But there are some very present challenges. And I'm interested especially in the environmental challenges that go into building one of these sites. They're often located in rural areas that have fairly limited environmental considerations, but some of these sites are deliberately built on brownfields. And it's a real estate play where you take sort of a low value site because it is previously contaminated. You spend some money to clean it up, and then you build a non-residential, low personnel use on it. Have you worked on some of those sites?
Just a few, but those are exciting ones.
Yeah.
Right. It takes a special type of owner.
Yeah.
to not be intimidated by it and see the opportunity of it. There's probably some cost that is born sooner than a vacant native piece of ground, but there are often benefits. Some of those sites maybe have some sort of power commitment to them already because they were a past smelting use or something like that, which is fun. And you hope to see those properties redeveloped into something better and cleaner, and have someone have a need for the property enough to where they're willing to clean that up. But it takes time and it takes money. And depending on if that was your only game, I don't know that people are jumping into that, but if that's kind of part of your portfolio where you can afford to do that and there's enough attribute, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me about the brownfield concept is if you do have room on your balance sheet for something like that, you can smooth out some of those time frame risks that we were talking about to give you time to do the cleanup and do the regulatory work that's needed as precedent to actually build the thing. And that allows you to put into place the pieces that you need to actually get the project done once the site is ready to build. But again, that only works for certain kinds of builders with certain kinds of portfolios. Yeah. So let's move into the future.
Yeah.
We are looking at a bright, brave new world of AI, just general increased cloud compute demand, and unknown future needs that will likely be placed into data centers. We've talked a lot about how chips change, how technology changes really fast. We're seeing quantum chips, still pretty speculative, but it could really, really change the game. And what seemed very speculative just a few years ago is now quite present. So, I mean, I know that you don't know the answer to this, but like when those things change, we're going to have to adapt the sites to fit this new kind of paradigm. Right?
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, it's inevitable that we will have to. I'm not quite sure how that is going to change. I hope that it results in smaller buildings, more dense buildings, because the size of the demand and the number of megawatts, the current form factors, right? You've got a 1,500 foot long building that is on a single slab. And there's very few places that are just flat like that. So there's a huge amount of terraforming that is required in its current state.
Yeah.
I think you can be a little less impactful to the land if we start to reduce the footprint of these things. So that's somewhat exciting. And I just think that as we've seen with the water demands with these facilities, how it's the technology and the innovation have how to cool these racks has changed over time. I have to imagine that there will be similar efficiencies with other resources that will help to pull the resource draw per unit of whatever we're building here down to a point to where it's better for everyone.
It's sustainable on an environmental level. It's also easier to build and just more adaptable. And, reducing the size of these buildings, I think, is a goal, an important goal. But at the same time, I saw a quote saying that like we're going to build AI factories you can see from space. And so there are tensions in the industry about how these things are going to look in the future. Engineering and regulatory is behind the meter energy generation. It's unlawful in certain jurisdictions, difficult in all jurisdictions, and delicate in a lot of ways. We're seeing increasing conversations about nuclear and small modular reactors, again, behind the meter. But even those, like if you're able to get over the regulatory hurdles and the relationship hurdles that are required to accomplish that, they need a not insignificant amount of space on a site, right? So how are you? I mean, I guess, are you working on behind the meter sites?
We are, and some of those, to the best that I can explain it from how we interact, and there are some amazing thought leaders in this area and experts. But it's really intriguing, and we're a little bit downstream from that. But what we see is kind of this microgrid approach where it's behind the meter, but it's also feeding back to the meter, and it's helping to offset a bit, the impact on the other users in that service territory, which is a good thing. Maybe smooth out some of the peaks, which is a good thing. But in terms of the real estate play and working with, real estate attorneys and legal professionals like yourselves, what you're doing now is you're trying to plan for what you don't know and anticipate the rights and access and to property and to the adjacent property or through an adjacent property for some unknown function that will reveal itself in the future. But if you can anticipate it now and speak to it, incorporate it into whatever the land negotiations, into your entitlement approvals now, if you don't need it, great. If you do happen to need it, you'll be thankful that you thought through it.
Yeah, it's data centers are inherently a real estate play, right? Even if you're building them so you can run AI compute, you're putting billions of dollars into a piece of real estate, and that makes it fundamentally a real estate play. And real estate is about the acquisition of rights and acquiring the rights that you need to either run fiber across somebody else's land or get power onto your land or access across your neighbor's land. Those rights are super important. And I think that it can get lost in the site due diligence and acquisition process that like, actually, we're going to need rights outside of the four corners of this dirt. So, I guess I always encourage my clients to think way downstream about what rights they might need and just accumulate whatever they can from the neighbors, which would be a small cost now, but a very large cost later. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a few scenarios that we've seen over the years where that neighboring property that is vacant and owned by someone and doesn't seem to be valuable or usable at this point in time seems to become necessary later.
Suddenly becomes very valuable.
Yeah, that's right. And whenever there has been a project in which you scratched your head early and said, well, I don't know why we're talking about this, that seems to be off-site, so to speak. I've never seen it play out to where there was regret at the long term. It's like, man, I'm really glad that we carved and dedicated the additional right-of-way to the municipality that, even though it wasn't quite in their code at the time, it opened up the ability for their utility extension and upgrades that we eventually needed anyway.
Building that kind of optionality into the project from the very inception, I think is underappreciated in this industry and can be very, very valuable down the road. And also just in terms of relationships, like keeping the relationship, because your neighbors are, like I said, real estate is inherently local. It is essentially local, and building those relationships and maintaining those relationships with your neighbors and with your local jurisdictions can yield tremendous benefits later on. Okay, so I think we've thoroughly covered the data center industry now. I'd like to just kind of wrap up with some closing takeaway thoughts. What would you say, based on your experience to date and what you're dealing with right now and what you're seeing into the future, what are the biggest takeaways that you want your clients to be thinking about as they diligence and then start to design and build their projects?
I'm probably not the only one that asked for this, but the more time you can build into the schedule upstream in the land play, I think will pay off later, even if your demand or signal or those needs aren't quite known. That kind of pre-positioning work is going to reduce your cost later and potentially reduce any pushback from the community. Whenever there's been kind of some pre-positioning thought to thoroughly look at through due diligence and not just get the site, go and deal with the issues as they pop up, which become either a schedule risk to some commitment that you've made on the lease, or becomes really, really expensive, perhaps to mitigate that schedule risk, even just a couple months. The investigations to do and to have a full understanding to where you can quantify what those risks are instead of just qualify what they might be is a valuable step that seems like having your team of professionals looking at that early on, having them involved in the strategy makes the execution of that strategy more efficient. Everyone has already drawn up the play, so to speak. And then when it comes time to move at lightning speed and get something permitted and constructed in a year and a half, becomes just an execution play. You're not having to iterate on strategic solutions to issues that come up. The issues are already known. That's my hope.
I would hope so too. And, I certainly, as the lawyer on these projects, would not object to giving ourselves a little bit more time to make these things work right. For my part, to go back to the idea of optionality, and I think this goes hand in hand with the additional timeline. is give yourself as much opportunity to adapt later on as you can. That means building in long-term due diligence on your purchase and sales so you can see how the industry is moving, get your site engineering at least preliminarily done ahead of time, get your land use done ahead of time, get options, use options contracts to get those rights across neighboring properties. And think about these things as you're going through site selection and due diligence on the sites, not after you've purchased the property. Those, I think, can unlock a large amount of optionality and value in the future for these projects. And I think the developers who are thinking about those things up front are going to be the successful ones.
I would agree. And I'd also add, you mentioned land use. There in many other industries, the concept of closing on land prior to getting some sort of discretionary approval is a no-no.
Yeah.
That's not the case here. And I think building in that optionality into those discretionary approvals for what you don't know, because the pace of the public process is not necessarily a fast one. And so if you go and you get the big thing through and get your community input and your whatever discretionary approvals you have to the extent you can, often means your timeline gets shorter when you actually have to pull the trigger on something.
And time is money.
Yep.
Well, Paul, I think that's all I have. Any other thoughts?
Oh, lots of thoughts, but
well, it's for the next
another
episode.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for joining me on this episode of the Lay of the Land podcast, and I look forward to chatting again in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Lay of the Land. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. Tune in next time for more real estate industry insights.